So I'm Renee O'Reilly. I am the new Assistant Vice President here at the University of South Carolina for Planning, Assessment, Innovation, and Strategy, and that is a huge title and a mouthful. But really, I was brought on board recently. I'm ending out my fifth week here. But really, it's to tell the story if we're doing the right things and we're doing them right. And how do we know that? But I want to start with something simple and really honest, coming from my almost 2 decades in this world, is that most institutions are not struggling with trying to understand the impact on students, not because they lack the data, but they might be struggling because they might lack the clarity, the connections to expectations and strategy, and what it really means, the meaning and context. And lastly, most importantly, the title of my presentation, they might be lacking the courage to actually act upon it. As you all know, which I'm sure on your institutions, we have a lot of dashboards, we have a lot of reports, a lot of metrics, but often we don't have the change associated with that or the data story and the impact on students. We might have some great numbers, but it doesn't really tell us the story. And I want to share something personal. As I just shared, I'm starting my fifth week here at the University of South Carolina. I recently transitioned from almost a decade at the University of Oregon, and prior to that, at the University of New Mexico. And my slides are being a little sluggish, but I promise they'll advance. But the same pattern exists. There are people working incredibly hard, producing data, because they've either built student learning outcomes or they've built administrative operational excellence outcomes, however you want to classify it. People are producing a large amount of data and they're building lots of beautiful reports and dashboards, but they're still asking the most fundamental question. Are we actually making that difference for students? Are we actually impacting the student experience, student success, however you fill in the blank, depending on where your positionality is in your respective institution? So this question has really stayed with me the last few weeks in thinking through how I think about this work and why this matters, because I realized it's not about having a sophisticated data system. It's not about having another survey or having another data set to collect and assess ourselves, but whether or not we're willing to use the data to make the decisions that matter. Because when we ultimately use that data intentionally, it becomes more than a report. It becomes that catalyst for change, for clarity, alignment, and impact. As you all know, there's a lot happening in the world. There's a lot happened in the last 6 years. I don't want to revisit COVID, but there's a lot that's happened. And even just in the last 6 years, we would be naive to think that it doesn't affect our students and the humans showing up to our campuses. So we have to be nimble and think about the way that we talk about assessment and we think about measuring student impact. But that only happens when we move beyond describing and focus on those decisions. I feel like as an institution, the accountability movement and a lot that's happened, we've really normalized this reporting. I mean, we have beautiful dashboards. We have lots of these reports. As I say on my new campus, I have all these fancy reports with all this beautiful data and infographics. But we rarely ask, well, what changed? What happened as a result? So that's not a data problem. That's a culture and leadership issue. So I want to offer a framework today as we walk through this about thinking about what comes next. So it's more than just what are we seeing, but why does it matter? And ultimately, what are we going to do and what will change? And if your data cannot answer all four, it's not finished. So again, this is just a slide to remind you. Data does not equal impact, reporting does not equal improvement, and activities alone don't equal outcomes. So I'm really here. I want to spend the rest of the time kind of just giving you exposure to this framework that I've been thinking about for a while and really help you differentiate between a culture that supports impact versus just talking about reporting and data. So as I always say, moving beyond compliance and thinking about that continuous improvement, and give you a flavor of the human-centered framework on how we can translate that data into meaningful insights and ultimately action to better support our students and identify opportunities to connect that data with other things that exist. And so really all this means is we need more time as humans to do this work. And so I hope by the time you leave this session today, I have some supplemental handouts and I'll have the questions throughout the slides. But it's really, I hope that you would ponder and think about one actionable strategy that you can do differently on your campus to promote that culture of courageous, value-aligned decision-making using the data that exists. So hopefully we can do that today. So the issue, let me name something we all recognize and I've alluded to early in this presentation today, is we've normalized the culture of reporting. I think we all have pretty clear mechanisms on our campus articulating what we hope students will walk away with, and in some ways what we hope employees will experience. And so we have that culture of, did we do it? Yes or no? Have we built things intentionally designed around some of those student learning outcomes? Have we intentionally built reports to assess and see where we've been? And so we've normalized the culture of these dashboards, assessment reports, compliance. But in most cases, things don't change. And again, that's a culture problem. So the hardest part of this conversation is, do we have the courage? And most importantly, do we have the support in our institution to do this? Because I will preface that there are instances where leadership doesn't want to see some of the hard data. They only want to see the good things. They only want to see the things that we can post on a website or put in an impact report. They don't want to have the conversations where maybe something is falling short. Because data often tells you things you don't always want to hear. And in that moment, you have a choice. Do we explain it away? Do we push it under the rug? Do we do the whole conformatory, bias where we only look at what is making us look good? Or do we actually act upon it? And if nothing changes, sadly, your data doesn't matter. And that's really sad, because courageous clarity really emerges from not just having the information, the data, and the alignment with whatever outcome we're focused on, but it's deciding intentionally and acting in alignment that matters most for our students. Because data doesn't create change, numbers don't inspire change. People and the work that we do on our campuses does that. And so I always say dashboards without decisions it's really sad. Assessment without an action. As I say, like, data without any purpose is just noise, and compliance without meaning. I mean, it's important that we have everything aligned. So this is a good reflection question, and this is just the space I've been in, starting a new role and what I'm doing. But I always ask, when was the last time a spreadsheet alone changed a decision? Maybe we had the most sophisticated student learning outcomes, and maybe we had incredible data to support that we were maybe meeting those outcomes and students were walking away with those things. But that alone isn't going to change behavior. Because what I learned is that people are the ones behind it, as I talked about recently. And people only act when the data becomes clear, it's meaningful, and it's aligned with what they care about. And so that's just kind of like, I always say, if your thing that you do, your job, disappeared tomorrow, what would people lose? That's the impact. That's the thing that we need to be connecting to. That's your core purpose. And I always say this work is really structured curiosity. So I want to offer that assessment is beyond compliance, and whatever we do has to have some type of connection to action. And it's more than just what's happening, but why does it matter and what should we do? I always say, if you stop at the first question, you're just reporting. But if you move to the second and third, you're leading in the space and you can actually influence change. And so when we talk about this model, the human-centered data and what that means, right? Like, isn't it all human-centered? These are numbers, right? But I want to really focus that at the center of all the data that you have access to and that you collect are students, possibly even staff, faculty, and other constituencies, depending on what you do in your institution. So it's not just metrics, it's not just dashboards, it's not just compliance. These are humans. And every data point that is collected represents a lived experience. And so when you look at the data, the real question becomes, whose experience are we seeing and whose are we missing? And that's why I'm a huge believer in when we think about human-centered data, in order to enact and have the courageous clarity to make decisions, we also have to think about equity and think about stories behind the numbers, and that sometimes one form of data collection and data will only give us this one sliver and lens. And it's important to layer other things on top of it, as well as faculty and staff's perspective, because that's absolutely valuable in the process. And so when we're thinking about courageous clarity, it's also important for us to think about lots of data and the people behind that. And so the shift that I'm talking about today, and it's probably not a big shift, I think a lot of us are here, but is beginning with your core purpose, right? We all have identified outcomes, right? That's our core purpose. We know why we're here. A lot of us are collecting evidence, and a lot of us might have meaning, but sometimes that falls short with the actual actions. I always say most institutions I've worked with, and I've done a lot of consulting, stop at the evidence and meaning, and they might internally do something, but they don't often talk about what they're going to do with the information. And impact and having the courage to act on it only happens when we move that into some type of decision or action. And I'm just going to share a couple of visuals because I'm a visual person by all means. But I think it's really important. This is a traditional cyclical assessment framework, which I'm sure you've all seen, maybe changing some of the semantics here. But again, everything begins with your why and your mission, and you build your outcomes, and then you build your programs and services, courses, etc. From that, you collect information to see if you're being successful. You interpret it, analyze it, have some type of action, and you close the loop, which I believe it's always constantly turning. But I like to layer on these two big questions that I framed at the beginning is, are we doing the right things and are we doing them right? And if we don't have enough time and space to talk about if we're doing the right things, we can never get to if we're doing them right. So it's really important when we're talking about building a culture of decision-making and actually acting upon the data and having that courage, it's important to also have these two questions constantly thinking about, because we shouldn't be doing the same things we did 20 years ago, because our students are very different today. And there is absolutely space to have the difficult conversations of thinking about pivoting and changing different things. Or, hey, this might actually be working, so we should be celebrating it. We should be identifying why it's working so well and share that with our colleagues so they can figure out how to better support other students. And so I'd like to have this visual to always remind me if we're doing the right things and we're doing them right. Plus, it makes it easy to describe my job, because I know sometimes when you do assessment, it can be a little convoluted and complicated. And I think everyone thinks you sit behind a computer and do data analytics, and that's what you do. But really, the sum of the experience is much more than that. So how do we move data to decisions? I always reference Amelia Parnell's work, You Are a Data Person. She's the current president of the NASPA, which is a huge student affairs organization. And what I love about that book is there's some background research in there where she talked to a bunch of leaders in higher education and said, are you all doing data-driven work? Like, are you using data to make fundamental decisions about student support, supporting your campus, making changes for the better for student success and student impact? And over 80% of them were like, yes, we are doing that. But when she actually went into the context and looking at, okay, are they actually doing these things? That fell very much short of this bigger picture, which is no surprise. I think we all love the buzzwords of the day. Yes, we're using data to make decisions. But how are we supporting the environment to do that? As I said earlier, when was the last time a spreadsheet or even a report alone changed the decision? What changes decisions is not just data. It's having the meaning and context, having the clear message, and having the courage to do something. So I want to talk a little bit about what you can do on your respective campuses. But before I do that, what culture do you have on your campus? And so please, if you want to post in the chat, what kind of culture do you think you have at your institution? Do you think you are in this courageous clarity space? Do you think you're more in a compliance reporting space? I would love to see in the chat any of those where you're at. I think that's an important conversation. So I'll give you a moment to either post in the chat or just individually reflect, because I do think that's important to do as well. Okay, well, as we go through, I'm sure we'll talk more about this. So how do we do this? What does this look like? This is the core framework I want to talk about today, is data storytelling. So it's not just what are you seeing? Why does it matter? But more importantly, what are you going to do? And what's actually going to change? And so this is a simple framework, right? I mean, there's lots of frameworks out there. There's also a QR code at the end, but then also I know Yadek will be sending a blog with the information and all this will be there. So there's some guided prompts there. But more important, it's like, what are we seeing? This is your evidence. This is all your data and information, and it's alignment with whatever institutional, programmatic, course level outcomes that exist. The why does it matter is the meaning. This is where most people struggle because this is the human connection. It's like, this is where we connect the data back to the humans. Like, why does this matter? What does it mean? And then thirdly, what are we going to do? So this is the leadership conversation I was alluding to earlier, is this is where we have to have the courage to decide on if we can do something with it. Do we have the supportive environment to actually move this forward to some type of action, or are we just going to continue to do business as normal? And lastly, what will this change? This is your impact conversation. And if your data can't answer all four, you need to rethink your data, because when we talk about having a courageous clarity environment, we need to think about all these things. So let me give you some examples of what this might look like in practice. And I'll just preface, most of my examples are beyond the classroom, mainly because I've been in student affairs, but I've also worked a lot with our academic partners. So we'll try to make I'll try to come up with some examples as well for course level. So an example, a weak example, is if you say on an impact report or website or some type of assessment report, 80% of students self-reported satisfaction with the student health center. That sounds great, right? But that doesn't get to the impact questions that we're looking at. So a stronger version of this would be students who are using counseling services within the student health center, combined with connecting with specific mentorship and coaching programs, showed a 9 times greater odds in retention than students with similar backgrounds not engaging with these supports. Then in this case, you could also layer in academic information and really tell a bigger story. So that's the difference, is turning your data into just a reporting situation, but really tying into impact. So how do you do this? So I always like to say data storytelling, but you need a data story plan, right? I know we're not all inherently storytellers. And this isn't just student affairs, this is institutional, this is academic, but there are key ingredients to telling this story. Every area in our institution has some type of data, whether they're directly collecting it or whether they're getting it from a student information system or another tool that collects this information. There's a lot of data, but not every area uses that data to drive decisions. And so hopefully this data storytelling plan can help you think about that. So what's your story in one sentence? That's the key, right? We want to pull people in. Unfortunately, we are in a world today where smartphones have made it incredibly difficult to get people to pay attention. So it's important that we think about like headlines. Context is, why does it matter? Why are you collecting this information? What does it have to do with your entire program, experience, course, etc.? And how does it connect to your own strategic priorities or institutional, whatever that might be? Then you have data, whether that's qualitative, quantitative, or multiple sources. You have some type of human connection. This is the meaning. This is bringing it to life. This could be a quote. This could just be some other context from the programmatic side. And what does this tell you? And then lastly, the action. What should be done as a result? What's next? And if you could change one thing next year based on this data, what would it be and why? Those are the forward-thinking questions. And so every data story plan can look different, but it usually essentially has all of these key ingredients which align it with that impact. And so I'm going to give you some other examples, and some co-curricular, some curricular. There's some layered of data in all of these. These are all real things for previous institutions, but kind of an example of this data storytelling and really tying it into impact and really having that courageous clarity to make a change. So the first example I'm going to provide is for first generation students and their experiences. So a lot of the data on a previous institution, we saw that first generation students were reporting higher levels of isolation and navigation barriers on a well-being instrument. We also were noticing that students who were connecting to some of the support earlier on were showing higher persistence in academic success. I didn't include in here, but we also worked with some of our faculty in some of our first year programs, and we were able to get some more feedback from them. And so we had all these sources of data kind of telling us a story that we saw that our first gen students were reporting more challenges, but then we were seeing, oh, look, there's some students who are getting connected. This looks like a great story. So why does this matter? As we all know, well, first generation status and identity is not a deficit. So we were really looking at it. How can we talk about the strengths, and how can we more importantly talk about the system of support? So because we know combined together from the research and we know from the work is that having the institutional support, whether it's academic, co-curricular, beyond the classroom, plus those student resilience together can drive ultimately student experience and student success. So the strategic question from all of this in terms of the action was, how intentionally are we designing all our systems, whether it's instruction in the first year, whether it's co-curricular, whether it's experiential, whether it's support-based, how are we intentionally designing our systems that normalize it's okay to seek help so that we can reduce that isolation and normalize help-seeking behavior for first-gen students. But ultimately, we know if we normalize that environment, that supports also our continuing generation students. So really, this example is just to show you that it's more than just having this chart here about showing that the number of connections increases outcomes and well-being, but it's more importantly, how are we designing our systems and support so that it serves all our students, and it also reduces the stigma against help-seeking, because we know from the literature a lot of our first-gen students tend to have lower help-seeking behavior because they see it as bad, not necessarily good. So that's just an example of data storytelling in action and how we tie it to respective outcomes. I want to give you another example, career readiness and student support success, because we all know this is like a huge topic in most institutions, the return on investment conversation, which can feel icky from like a true academic experience, because we're like, we hope students go to higher ed and they explore and they engage, but there's this pressure on us to make sure, are we preparing our students for the next step? So a lot of the data that we collected on a previous institution was about these National Association of Colleges and Employers competencies around critical thinking, communication, teamwork, all the facets that we know that this entity has created as saying that these represent career readiness. And if students get access to these experiences and they build these skills, like this is good for their competency. So everyone thinks it has to be an internship program. That's what meets the needs for career readiness, when actually we know from an educator perspective, students are developing career readiness in all facets and experiences in our educational ecosystem, whether it's in the classroom or beyond the classroom. They're experiencing this. But in this context, leadership at the time was like, no, we need to look at this internship program. So we did a pre and post assessment, and we found that some of the lowest areas for our students were in communication and career and self-development, which meant that they were, they didn't have some of the technical skills with like communicating information or locating information, and they weren't really clear on how to develop themselves from a career perspective. And so embedded in this internship program was a bunch of workshops designed around some key topics. And overall, students perceive those as valuable. But what's the most interesting data point in this whole collection is we also did some feedback from site supervisors, because we wanted to say, okay, you have basically this free intern, like it's being paid for by another source. And we found that if there was intentional mentorship embedded in that, that was rated as the most positive, and that had the most impact on students. And because this all matters, we all know beyond the return on investment, we know that career readiness is developmental. And as I said earlier, students are developing this skill set inside and outside the classroom in a lot of things that they're engaged in. But from the internship program that we were looking at, we really found that some of the workshops that were better aligned with these career competencies were areas that we really needed to spend time on, as well as provide students some more opportunity to develop their professional confidence by having that site supervisor mentorship. So really the strategic question for answer through all this analysis, and there was a lot of data, this is just one picture with the many other pictures we had, but the strategic question was, how are we intentionally aligning workshops, mentorship, site experiences with actually measurable career readiness competencies? Because that's the fundamental question. If we're thinking about that intentionally, can we design that beyond just internship programs? Can we take that to the classroom? And I have got wind of a lot of institutions who are changing their core curriculum to layer in career readiness into that, because we all know not all students are going to the career center, career services. It's a outside the classroom thing. So how do we bring that back to students? And so that's kind of the strategic question in terms of action. And lastly, the other example I wanted to provide was co-curricular experiences and student well-being. At a previous institution, we had a longitudinal well-being assessment with really rich data that measured a lot of facets of student well-being. But higher co-curricular engagement, we were starting to notice that those students had higher GPAs, right? We also noticed minimal engagement meant that our students were struggling. And so this is like the age-old question that I've seen for years in the field. But really is digging a little bit deeper. Could we actually look at the factors of students and the profiles of students who are engaging, and what does that look like versus the students that aren't? Because we know that engagement is not extra. And we know that it coupled with instruction is a really powerful experience. So the bigger question is, how are we designing our entire educational ecosystem for integration of those two things? Because we know that when students are engaging, it's good, but we know that some students don't have the same opportunities to engage, because we do know our lower income students tend to be working more and they don't have as much time. So how are we designing all our systems equally in our institution to be able to provide them those experiences? And so hopefully you can see the strategic connection here. And that's how we build courageous clarity, institutional courage. And I just want to do a nod to operational examples, just because I feel like they always get forgotten. I think we only think about direct student learning outcomes, but we don't think about the operations, right? We don't think about the facilities and the buildings that foster belonging and community and support our academic instruction or our beyond the classroom experiences. So this is just like a nod to my operational folks, because I think sometimes they feel like they're maybe not seen in this bigger picture of student success and student impact. But like a perfect example is, 25 million was spent to renovate the new College of Arts and Sciences. Great. It's a beautiful building. It's got probably like a fancy donor's name on it. Great. We cut the red ribbon. That's fantastic. But really the strong example here is that if students are engaging with this building that maybe weren't using the space, they're now building connections that they weren't before. And they're more likely to interact with advisors, staff, peers, possibly faculty. And those connections translate into higher well-being and stronger academic performance. So it's important to think about also this aspect of the student impact is having safe, healthy places for students to connect, and also faculty to connect with students and staff to connect with students, and so forth. So I'm going to pause here. I'm looking at the chat. If there's any key questions, I want to start maybe addressing those before I go into the problems and the institutional courage issues.
Brenda, I know you mentioned some of the connections, but can you name a specific strategy that we can use for first generation students to feel more connected? And how will we know it's working? Like for example, increasing the use of services, better persistence, or improved performance.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of evidence-based practices for first-gen students out there. I think one that really resonates with that personal resilience is the peer connection, and the role modeling is big. That seems to be an area. I mean, I could go on and on. This could be a whole session, right? There's
Yeah.
lots of practices out there. I'm also a first-gen student, so I relate with this one too, is having peers do intentional mentorship with students within their first year, because you create that community, that cohort feel, that family-like feel that really helps them be seen. And sometimes institutions where they might not feel like they're seen. I feel like community colleges do a really good job of this. I don't know if 4 years are as up to speed in terms of fostering that and normalizing that it's okay. But I would say that would be a good example of like a practice. Now, in terms of are you doing it right? Well, that depends on your context and that depends on how it's being delivered. Is that embedded into a program? Is that embedded into the course? Again, that has to go back to your why. Like, where is this coming from and why does that matter? And then building your assessment from there, right? I also think there's power in the student voice, but beyond a survey. I think everybody does surveys, right? It's like there's lots of alternatives to surveys. There's lots of ways to get this information. Could we build some feedback into that process? Could we also go with this where the students are and do more focus groups? I think people think about focus groups in the traditional sense. You post something that there's going to be a focus group and you expect students to come. Instead, I always try to flip that on its head and say, go where the students are and do the focus groups there because you have a captive audience. Go to a course. I mean, in our current structure here on my current campus, we have a very powerful University 101 experience. And so using that as a way to get some data and information is always a really good place. But I would say it depends on the way that you're set up and how it's being run and fielded. I think that feeds into everything, but I think it goes back to your core is why does it exist?
And one more, there was something in the chat too. There's sometimes there's a, depending on your institution, right? There's a misconnect within student affairs, or some of us we call it student services and instruction, or academic, there's no connection. Student affairs or student services, they tend to focus more on student achievement data, your GPA, retention, specific completion rates, persistence rates, right? And academic, just focus on totally different outcomes, right? And how do you connect the the student affairs with the academic? Because there has to be some sort of connection.
Well, it gets into, as I said earlier, we have all the data, but we might not be connecting the dots, right? And that's where it takes the courageous leaders to come together and say, hey, let's pull all this information together. Let's ask some fundamental questions and look at it. Because I absolutely agree with you. Our students aren't experiencing our campuses in these departmental divisional boxes. They're coming to campus, they're experiencing campus in their own student journey, which looks different for all our students. When we think about assessment of that impact, our assessment has to be dynamic and holistic enough to be able to account for that. And it will never fully account for the dynamicness of humans, right? Because it's complicated. But we have to leverage and connect lots of sources. But that also takes leadership. I've been on campuses where academic and student affairs were like, it was like two bulls, horns at each other, right? I've been on campuses where it's more of a partnership. I've seen campuses where they have a joint person who is like an associate provost who oversees student affairs as well as academic, right? So it really depends on the leadership because the leadership can really drive or stymie this kind of experience. But I do believe when we think about institutional change and courage, we have to all come together to talk about those things. And we have to look beyond the traditional metrics. I think when I started this job, it was all looking at how engagement in student affairs impacts retention and graduation, because that's how we tell our story. But it's more than that. It's more than, of course, we want students to come back. Of course, we want them to graduate. But there's more to looking at student impact than those metrics, right? And the same thing for the academics in terms of instruction, in terms of each course and each syllabi and the respective student learning outcomes. Those absolutely are valid. So how do we look at this from a whole picture? And so I'm a huge believer that it has to take courage and leadership to be able to act on the data, but also create the infrastructure to support that leveraging of information. So thank you. Okay, wow, this is a lovely conversation. So thank you for those questions. I will say, as I said earlier, not all data storytelling is positive, and it can be uncomfortable. This is something that I still don't know if there's a model out there that's doing it right, based on my experience. I think it's happening in pockets. But this is the hardest part of this, is sometimes we find out that a program experience or a course isn't working. It might not be delivering on what it's intended to deliver on. we might see certain students struggling. Basic needs is a real one. I'm sure I've had many faculty come to student affairs over the years because they don't know how to support the students with basic needs, and our basic needs are super tapped. So if you're hungry and you have any other kind of basic needs insecurity, that's going to affect the way you show up and learn and engage. And so we know that this is happening. And we know that sometimes our resources are misaligned because we all know leaders are people, and we all know that not all leaders are great equally. And so in that moment, we have a choice. Do we explain it away or do we align it with our values? And are we in a space to be able to do that? I've been in institutions where there hasn't been a supportive space for this conversation. I've been in spaces where I've been told, Renee, you only give us the good data. We don't want to see the bad data. We don't want to look bad, right? So I do want to say that sometimes, even though I talk about in a Pollyanna world, it'd be great if everyone had institutional courage to act upon and connect all this work to student success and impact. Sometimes, unfortunately, we're in spaces where we have barriers to do that. And some of those barriers, as you're going through, because I'm always thinking about like well-being of our people who work on our campuses, and you can spin your wheels really fast and burn yourself out. I think some of the barriers to this is a fear. It's very fear-based, like fear of making the wrong decision or feeling like you failed, right? I've had situations where there's been legacy programs that existed for 40 plus years on a campus, but the data, one source of data was saying it was amazing, but when you started on packaging it and looking in and layering it these other things, we realized it wasn't returning on what it was supposed to do for our students, and in some cases causing more harm. And that was a hard discussion to have because we had people saying, like, no, this program works. It's not bad. Because most of these barriers are human, right? Is we're fearful. We think that assessment is a gotcha. We see it sometimes historically as an audit, as a compliance only exercise. And that breeds like a culture of ickiness, right? And so it kind of perpetuates these barriers. Sometimes people have a lot of information, but they have the lack of clarity. They don't have the connection with things. I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations where like, I have all this data, I don't know what to do. It's like, well, why are you doing this thing in the first place? Like, let's go back to your why. Or like, what do you want to know about students? What are some of your curiosities? What are the things that would help you do your job better? I mean, even just having basic questions like that. Also, we have a lot of siloed data. I think, as you mentioned, Enrique, like this is probably one of the biggest issues on our campus is everybody has call them their sandboxes where we collect all this great information and we hold on to it and we don't share it. I know some campuses are moving to data lakes, but then people are like, oh, I don't want my data in there. Or, there's like the privacy restrictions. And so there's a lot of siloed data. So we might, one area might be doing a really good job over here, but if they don't have access to this data, it's not the whole story of the student experience. And so it's really important that we think about this from a dynamic human experience. And then sometimes you're on campuses where other barriers are people don't feel ownership. They're like, oh, that's not my job. That's above my title, or I'm just here to do this. So how do we foster that, right? And again, that comes down to ultimately leaders and having supporter leaders to do this. So this is just a visual that I like to show folks to remind them that I call it the 3 C's. This is something when I talk about data storytelling and I talk about connecting this to impact, which is ultimately that action, is I think about, okay, we need all this context, we have all this information, but what's the consequence of us not doing anything or doing the same thing that we've always done or not sharing it? Like there's consequences to that. What's the risk of that? And then there's the call to action. It's important to think we have to have all the context and information, think about the consequence of either acting on it or not acting it, because it could go either way. And the call to action. What are we actually going to do differently as a result of this experience? I also want to mention there are lots of uses for data storytelling. As I mentioned earlier, we have these beautiful impact reports. We all might have like a great report at the end of a semester or term on what we did and how we align things. And that's great. But there's also some other things when we're talking about improvement and advocacy, those are also very valid stories to tell. I wouldn't say that those are the ones that go on the website or go in some public domain. Those are sometimes the conversations we have with other humans as we co-create solutions. And I think it's really important to normalize that just because we see something bad in the data doesn't mean that we've failed. It just means we need to think about things differently. And we either need to advocate and build support, or we need to get some support from others to guide our progress. And I think those are just great opportunities. And I think that's where the collaboration, cross-divisional, cross-campus partnerships can really come into play to help kind of co-create those solutions together. I think that's really a powerful message. So I can't encourage that enough. And lastly, my last visual is really the 5 whys. This is not something I created, but I do think it's a really nice framework sometimes when we're thinking about having that courageous clarity and that courage to act upon the data. Sometimes we stop at the meaning and we say, oh, that answers this one question and that's the why. But if we take it down a couple of layers, it starts to give us some other insight that we might not have seen if we stay at the surface level. And so an example of this that I've kind of seen in the field is we're seeing males engage less than females. This is, I think, happening universally everywhere. It's a topic of conversation. People are like, we don't have as many males engaging. Why? Well, one of the reasons could be maybe they're not perceiving engagement the same way as our female identifying students. Or it could just be that we've had so many females engaging and we're really good. The more people that come to our experiences, our courses, we get feedback. We end up building on that feedback, right? That's the action piece. Well, we might be perpetuating building things that females might be more interested in. Like student affairs, we're so good at this. We do a lot of workshops and we do a lot of discussion groups. Those typically are ways that females tend to engage in more than males. So it's not really a matter of the onus is on the male student for not engaging, but it might just be that our structure isn't supportive of the ways that they want to engage. And so that's an example of how you could take the 5 whys to kind of go down a layer and kind of see things from different ways. Again, doing this in community is even better because you can get into that co-creation world with your colleagues, whether it's in your own area or across campus, which I highly encourage. I think it's really powerful. So how do you turn your data into impact? So I want to take a moment for you all to, if you have something to write on, or if you want to use your phones or your computers, but I want you to write a couple of answers to these questions. So what's some data that you currently report on right now? What's data that you currently report? And you can write this down. So take a moment to do that. And then the second layer is, why does it matter? Not just to students, but maybe to staff, faculty, or other constituency groups. So why does it matter? And what decision can it inform? And what would you change with this data? So I'll give you a moment to, what I say, rewriting your data as a decision. And I'm just going to peruse the chat as you're writing down and reflecting to make sure I'm not missing anything. So as you're thinking about this and writing this down, I think it's really important. I want to emphasize equity and interpretation, what I mean by that. Lots of semantics and vernacular today. Hopefully I didn't overwhelm you. When I phrase equity and interpretation, I'm saying that we all come from our different experiences and backgrounds, and we all have our individual jobs and positional influences on our campus, whatever that might be. If you teach, if you're in administration, whatever you do, we all have our little sphere. When we bring other people into the fold, it gives us other layers and lenses of interpretation that are absolutely critical for doing this work. And so that's why I use the phrase co-creation, and really that embeds the equity and interpretation piece. So hopefully that's a little bit clearer. Well, if anyone wants to share their thoughts in the chats about this exercise, turning your data into impact, I just want you to reflect at the meta level here is, What changed when you reframed your data? Did anything feel harder? Did it feel okay? Because this is a shift from just describing to actually building it into some type of decision point. So if anyone wants to share in the chat, I'll be happy to fill those. So how do
Um,
you build this? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
there was one that's really kind of took my caught my eye from Virginia Moran is program review data for allocation requests could be used to spur more transparent dialogue. SLOs and regarding SLOs programming improvement and change access to reporting. I mean, talking about program review, right? That's when what
Program
in
review is a really good source of data that I think people often overlook. That's why I was trying to do a nod to the operational side, right? I do think program review information can be incredibly helpful. Um, I also, it's funny, I'm doing a session this summer, the strategic assessment and investment allocation piece, because I do think those go in tandem with each other. And I do think that for allocation requests, those are a very interesting conversation. And I've seen cases where they're used probably not in the best ways, and I've seen great ways to advocate and build upon program infrastructure. Again, it comes down to leadership. So I do agree. I think program review data can be absolutely critical to layer in yet another source of information.
okay.
So in order to build this culture, part of it is normalizing asking that so what? Now what? What do we do with this information? What can and can we not do? How do you embed that? I think everyone, as we all know, sometimes assessment can be seen as an extra thing, an add-on. How do we embed it into what we're already doing? How do we even just bring like one of these questions to like a staff or faculty meeting to just have a conversation? Or if there's a committee across campus that you serve on, like how are we normalizing building this culture around beyond reporting? And so how are we rewarding that? And so the bigger question is how do the data stories, and this is the nod to the resource allocation, drive priorities for resource allocations and investments? Again, this can be used in nefarious ways and it can be used in really positive structural ways to improve the experience for our colleagues and our students, right? So if you're in a leadership role, this is where your leadership matters, but I'm a huge believer everybody has positional influence and we can all within our spheres of influence change this culture. And I think that's really powerful to remember. I think that there's a lot of people who think, oh, it's because you're only in this role. Well, that's not true because there were other roles I was in early in my career where I really didn't have a position of power, but it's about changing the dynamic because 99% of this work is relational and how we work with other humans. So it's important as we think about that. So just some key takeaways for today is besides overwhelming you with lots of vernacular and thinking about this is data is only valuable if it drives decisions ultimately. We have a lot of data on our campuses, and this data storytelling, all it's doing is creating an alignment and helping us be more coherent in our clarity with the long-term goal of making a difference. And so courage really creates that change. And it's so incredibly important because if nothing changes with the data, why are we collecting the information? And that makes me very sad because I love data, all data. But we need that courageous clarity because it's about seeing things clearly, it's measuring what matters, deciding intentionally, and acting in alignment with our values. I think every mission at probably every post-secondary educational institution probably has some moral return, some moral obligation to educate our students, right? And so are we actually acting in alignment with those values? And so I hope that, the final challenge to you all is what will you stop reporting? What will you start changing? Because we know data alone doesn't create the change. The number alone doesn't inspire change, but that the people do. And how do we foster that culture? So I'm going to pause. That's all I have. So I'm open for questions. I wanted to give us some time before the hour to address anything.
The something was raised in the chat too. I'm just kind of paraphrasing here. The word leaders, right? You often mention leaders and not often your leaders are right on the track, your BPs, your deans or divisional deans. It's sometimes like it might be you. I see those the coordinators, the program review coordinators, the curriculum coordinators, your whatever it is, your guided path coordinators, they're the ones moving, the needle. They're the ones impacting stuff, and you can see it, right? Not to say that the administration is not doing the job, but I can see it, at the working bees doing the job. And so, how do you address that? I mean, is that a culture change, institutional change?
It's all of the above. This takes a lot of people, and I do think a lot of the work is happening in the trenches. And so part of my job is, as I tell people when we're doing this work, I'm trying to make your job easier, but I'm also trying to like elevate your voice and experience because it's not just about the impact we have on students, but it's also like the structural pieces and the work that it takes to do this. So a lot of work that I do too to do that is I do a lot of social network analysis, and that's just a fancy way of making a pretty picture showing all the intricate web of connections that happen behind the scenes to make a program or experience tick. That sometimes gets hidden when we focus just on the direct student impact. And so I do that in the background so people feel validated and seen, because I do think that's important. Because I do think there's times, well, again, not all leaders are created equally, and in some cases, they can do more harm than good. But I do think the importance of assessment is that we think about it from a data storytelling lens. It can elevate the multiple voices and experiences, not just looking at the student impact and the humans that we're impacting, but also the people alongside of us that are also critical to this work. So I'm a huge believer in that, and it's going to take everything. It's a culture change, and if you're in a regime, I call them regimes. I'm all about the territory building because that's how I describe it, because I don't think that's healthy. But if you're in a regime that's not super supportive of this, that's definitely a little bit harder to do. But I do think that a lot of change does happen in the trenches, and we have a lot more positional influence than I think sometimes we realize.
And there was one in the chat from Steve Erdman. Um, to build a culture of evidence, make sure that the every proposed survey or investigation will produce an actionable findings, no matter what the data say, right? That's hard, and that the respondents will get a report on the results of the investigation.
That's such a powerful statement because how many of us actually give information back to our students after we compile it, right? At national conferences, like where there's 200 people in the room, I'm like, raise your hand. How many of us send our information back to our students? That's such a powerful way to connect back with students. I can't tell you how many coffees and connections with students I've had over the years because I've sent them something back and I've said, hey, we did this and you're represented in it. Did I do a good job representing your voice? Do you feel like you're seen in these results? Is there anything I can do differently? And of course, most students, they don't check email and they don't really look at it. But I do have a handful of students who've historically said, oh, thank you for, I feel seen. Would you like to be? And of course, meeting with students is not part of my job, but it was also like a really powerful moment for me to connect with the students. But I do think that's an unseen. And we won't get too into the surveys. I feel like that could be a whole session. But I would like people to think differently about surveys because we can get this data in lots of different ways. We don't have to do yet another survey. And I don't know how many times I've seen surveys with 122 questions when they're only using 5. Like, why are we doing that to students? Like, are you going to take a 122 item survey? No, I do think there needs to be very clear alignment. I pressure my colleagues to do that. I make them do an Excel spreadsheet. Like, you have this question, how is it going to be used and why does it matter to your data story? And should we be asking students that? But hey, this other area is collecting it. So why are we both asking students? Like, let's reduce that and reduce duplication.
Thank you. Steve, go ahead and
Yeah,
mention.
uh, I think you really, I liked what you just said. I want to go to the first part of my question, which is um, I've seen too many surveys over the years where someone says, I want to do X I need to get data that I can use to support my case. So they send out a survey. Um, the data don't come in the way they expect, and it's not actionable because they never considered the other side of the question or the other sides of the question. It makes it again more time consuming to do any kind of inquiry, including a survey. Just as are you going to be reporting the results back and so on? But I think the physician's oath above all do no harm. Too many of our inquiries do harm. That is, they convince respondents never to respond again.
Oh yeah, no, I mean it's like survey fatigue. Like we go get a haircut, we get a survey. We go buy something, we get a survey, right? It's like, do we really need a survey? Now, surveys can be a great method for data collection, but we have to make sure we're aligning our values and our core purpose of why we're doing this. And so, yeah, absolutely, I agree. I think there are lots of times where we do more harm than good, and we're just perpetuating the lack of the powerful source of data we have from our students by over surveying them and not being intentionally smarter about how we do it.
Gregory, would you like to unmute yourself? You have a powerful things in the chat.
Yes, happy to. Great conversation. Thank you, Renee. One of the things I've noticed as a kind of growing pattern, and I've been at like 5 or 6 different community colleges, is what often, with good intent, begins as a data investigation is an effort to examine how to improve a poorly designed process. I can go off on early alert programs here a little bit if time were to I've had time on that. But when really what you need is a process redesign. And those questions that would expose or data requests that would expose the need for a process redesign won't often come from the college. It requires somebody to take initiative and say, we're going to look at this differently. No one's asking for this. And then that's a much harder conversation.
Well, I think you're like alluding to like the confirmation bias too, right? Like this is the equity of interpretation, whether you call it, I know I'm like in an anti-DEI state, so I'm probably not even able to say that, but like regardless of the semantics, like this is where it's important to include other people because sometimes we get in our sandboxes and we see things in a certain way and we might just be doing it because we've always done it. And we might not be thinking about it in the ways that we need to. And so sometimes bringing in somebody else with a different critical lens can help push us and challenge us to think differently. And that's why I always call myself the assessment shepherd, is I'm not really like, I'm just there to kind of shepherd people together and reframe. But we need more of those opportunities to do that work, because otherwise we're just confirming our biases and then we're perpetuating these things that sometimes, and it's okay to, this is the thing that we have a hard time in student affairs is sunsetting things, right? Is being able to say it's okay to stop doing this because this was built 20 years ago, but it's not working anymore. And that's okay. You're not a bad person. You didn't do bad work. It's just our students are different students and they're doing things different. They're engaging in our campus in a different way. And we have to be able to evolve with that. So I like to see it as an evolution. Is how are we evolving? So I think that's why it's important to bring other people in. And sometimes you need leaders or other people to challenge that conversation. Absolutely. So thank you for sharing that.